Khalil. I'm the director of the Muslim Studies program. Oh, and I better record. Yes. Thank you, Mary, for reminding me. We're both going to record just in case. Well, welcome everyone to this lecture entitled The Abode of Islam or the Abode of War, Migrations of Bosnian Muslims in the 19th and 20th century, and Fatwas of the Ulama. And we are delighted to have with us Professor Ehlimana Memisevic from the University of Sarajevo. And I'd like to, first of all, thank Mary Ferdowsi for arranging the logistics for this event. And also I want to thank the co-sponsors for this event. They include the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities, and Peace and Justice Studies. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. By the way, let me just say a brief word about the format. You'll notice we're using a webinar format. So during the lecture, you may feel free to type in questions in the Q&A. And at the end, we'll have Q&A. And this lecture, the whole session runs from 2 to 3:15. And so we'll have maybe 15 or 20 or so minutes for questions at the end. So let me go ahead and introduce our guest speaker. Professor Ehlimana Memisevic is an assistant professor at the Department of Legal History and Comparative Law at the Faculty of Law, University of Sarajevo. She holds her BA in law and her MA and PhD in legal history from the University of Sarajevo. She is currently a Fulbright visiting scholar at the College of Arts and Science at Vanderbilt University. Her major research fields include the history of Islamic law and institutions in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the post-Ottoman period, migrations of Bosnian Muslims, including the ethnic cleansing and genocide against Bosnian Muslims at the end of the 20th century, and more broadly, Islam in Europe. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Memisevic.
Thank you so much, Professor Khalil, and thank you all for coming. I'm sorry, I just disappeared for a second to take my notes for this lecture. I just realized that I didn't have it with me. Thank you all for coming. I heard that you have a really snowy Wednesday afternoon, and I appreciate especially that you came due to those weather circumstances. My research that I'm conducting at the Vanderbilt University within the Fulbright Visiting Scholar Program deals with the migration of Bosnian Muslims at the end of 19th century until the end of 20th century, and basically it includes three big waves of the migration of Bosnian Muslims. First was at the end of 19th century, after Bosnia became part of the Austria-Hungary, actually after the occupation of Austria-Hungary, occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina by Austro-Hungary. The second biggest wave of the migration of Bosnian Muslims became after the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina by Austria-Hungary from 1908 to the First World War. And finally, the biggest wave of mass migration was until at the end of 20th century, caused by the ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Bosnian Muslim population, i.e. Bosniak. I'll explain using these terms later on, but Bosniaks are the same as Bosnian Muslims, so I'll probably use it interchangeably. I have a PowerPoint, so I'll just share with you right now. Okay, so basically, I was interested in how Bosnian Muslims ulama or Islamic leadership responded to those challenges of mass migration of Bosnian Muslims. Just to give you a brief overview or background of the historical circumstances. The end of 19th century, the beginning of 20th century was marked by continued emigration of Muslim population from the Balkan region, which was the consequence of the disintegration of the Ottoman state on one side, and on the other side, the rise of the Balkan nationalism. After losing the Ottoman territories and after the rise of the Balkan national states in the 19th century, Muslims turned from a dominant group to a minority. In the newly established Balkan states, national states, national homogeneity was achieved through ethnic cleansing, involuntary change of demographic structure of the population through wars and persecution of Muslims. According to the official statistics from the Berlin Congress, actually from 1878 until the First World War, around 1.5 million Muslims left the Balkans, and 150,000 Muslims left Bosnia and Herzegovina after the Austro-Hungarian rule. Migrations, as I said, continued in 20th century, reaching its culmination in the most recent wave of migration of Bosnian Muslims caused by ethnic cleansing and genocide from the period 1992 to 1995. So first wave of the migration was caused by the Austro-Hungarian occupation of Bosnia later on Bosnia and Herzegovina, which resulted in the changes in relation between Islam and the state, which were unprecedented in the history of Islam in Bosnia and in the Balkans in general. It confronted the Bosnian Muslims with the crucial issues of living within non-Muslim rule. Could they stay in their homeland after it had been occupied by the non-Muslim state, or should they migrate to Ottoman territory? If they stayed, what would be their duties to the new authorities? Number of questions that sought theoretical and practical answers arose. For instance, are Muslims allowed to live under the non-Muslim rule? Are Muslims allowed to serve in a non-Muslim army? How to organize religious, educational, vakuf, Sharia law institutions in a non-Muslim state, etc. Every Bosnian Muslim family and each individual responded to these questions in practice by deciding whether to stay in Bosnia and Herzegovina or whether to migrate. As I said, around 150,000 Bosniaks decided to move, to leave Bosnia and move to the Ottoman territories in the period between 1878 to 1918. However, these challenges, as is well known, were mutual to all Muslims who were living at the periphery of the Muslim world in the 19th century due to European colonial expansion. But in terms of culture, economy, and politics, Muslims in the Balkans were in much more difficult situation than the Muslims in the rest of the Europe, which was the consequences of the fact that the militant Balkan elites explained their slow development with relation to the Western Europe as quote to quote 500 years long Turkish oppression, very often called Turkish yoke, and they projected their anger against for losing their illusions on Muslims who and by identifying them with the Turks. So as is well known, of course, Sheikhul Islam issued a fatwa in Istanbul on the requirement of the migration of Muslims from former Ottoman provinces in the Ottoman territories, but the Bosnian Muslim Ulama considered or was concerned with the intensity of migrations of Bosnian Muslims after the occupation by Austro-Hungarian rule. They realized that the migration threatened the survival of Bosnian Muslims, and they claimed that, as they said, one of them was quoted saying that now Vatan, which is homeland, Bosnia, i.e. Bosnia, is in danger, and not Islam or Deen or faith. So the then Mufti of Tuzla, who you can see on this photo, on this picture, Mehmet Tevfik Azabagic, wrote a treaty called Risala on Hijra, in which he considered categories of Darul Islam and Darul Harb in the spirit of enlightenment. pointing at their irrelevance in the given circumstances and time for the Bosnian Muslims. He rejected the analogy between the Prophet's hijrah, which was necessary for the survival of Muslims, as he said, and hijrah of Bosnian Muslims, which threatened the survival of Islam in this part of the world. His treatise is consisted of the three parts. In the first part, he restate Hanafi's position toward Hijra, Darul Islam, and Darul Harb. For instance, he quotes the hadith that there is no hijrah since the conquest of Mecca. Hijrah was only mandatory from Mecca, and that obligation was relaxed after the conquest. He said, for instance, he first of all quotes hadith and the verses of Quran ayah, and then he gives his own explanation, relying mostly on Hanafi scholars. For instance, he said, as for the hadith reported of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, whoever has fled from one land to another for his faith, even by but 1 foot, he has earned paradise, Jannah, even as he said, even if the hadith was reliable, sahih, it wouldn't prove hijrah obligatory. It includes reference to flight, which means to leave a land out of fear and uncertainty. He said, as this hadith suggests, the fear should be for one's faith and may include fear for one's life, property, and children, as keeping them safe is part of faith. The hadith suggests that we are obliged to keep our faith in any way we can, even by flight. Hijrah is not an obligation in and of itself, but only as a mean to meeting our other obligations. What is obligatory is keeping the faith, and hijrah is a way of doing this. And then he uses which use hijrah in a metaphorical sense. For instance, this one presented at the PowerPoint presentation: a Muslim is one who avoids harming Muslim by tongue or hand, and a muhajir is one who abstains from what Allah has forbidden. And the second one, for instance, the mujtahid is one who makes jihad against his nafs, ego, in obedience to Allah, and mujahir is one who abandons sin and forbidden deeds. The second part of his treaty is dealing with the concepts of Darul Islam and Darul Harb, and how Darul Harb can become Darul Islam and vice versa. He's again quoting Hanafi scholars and authorities, claiming that certain territory is considered as Darul Islam so long as specific regulations and observations are practiced there. Among those observances are Friday and 8 prayers. In addition, the manifestation of Islam includes the application of Islamic law, at least in personal matters, even if it is by qadis appointed by a non-Muslim ruler. All these existed in Bosnia under the Habsburg rule. And then he claims that Darul Harb can become Darul Islam if Islamic legal requirements like the performance of Friday and 8 prayers can be fulfilled, regardless of whether the local population is non-Muslim or the land connected to Islam, or if the land is connected to Islamic territory. And finally, the third part of his Risala deals with the comparison between Prophet's hijrah and hijrah of Bosnian Muslims. He subscribes to the view that the migration is not a religious obligation after the conquest of Mecca. Furthermore, he held that the analogy between hijrah of the Prophet and migration of Bosniaks is not valid. The former, he said, brought the mobilization of Muslims and their victorious return to Mecca, and the later is more an expression of and a move toward further weakness without possibility of a victorious return. For instance, he says, I quote, he says, Hijra comes at the time of old age in Islam. It is movement inverted to weakness that produce weakness after weakness. It is like spending much money to earn a single coin, selling the obviously expensive jewels of the homeland to buy ordinary unclear mud. Then he said that the difference between the hijrah of Prophet, peace be upon him, and the hijrah of Bosnian Muslims is like the difference between thin and thick, between the shell and the pearl of great price. Today's hijrah is a thing that hides much risk, and what oscillates between benefit and danger is usually dangerous in the end. He wrote this Risala in 1884, so it's like 6 years after the occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, first in Arabic language, and it was published in Arabic language, which means that it was meant for the rest of Bosnian Ulama, which under the and it was a custom until the Second World War for Ulama to controversial issues explain in Arabic language, and later on, 2 years later, his fatwa was translated to Turkish language, which was meant for the Bosnian wider Bosnian population, because they were at the time conversant in Turkish, and finally, only in 1990s this fatwa was translated in Bosnian, which signifies the return of Bosnian Muslim ulama to the views of the not a return, but the reactualization of these the views of the ulama at the end of 19th century to deal with the challenges with the migration at the end of 20th century. An official appointed by Sultan Abdul Hamid, Ibrahim Dervish Pasha, whose proposal of migration measures played a key role in the history of migrations and their influence to the reconstruction of the Ottoman Turkish identity, criticized Mehmet Tevfik Azapagic Risala as it discouraged migration. He advised the Istanbul scholars to reveal to Bosnia the genuine meaning of Sunnah and Hadith on migration. The other Bosnian scholar, this is one of more quotes of the Risala on Hijra. The other Bosnian scholar who at the time dealt with the issue of migration of Bosnian Muslims was Hafiz Muhammad Emin Hadžijahić. He was an intellectual. He spent a lot of time in Istanbul, but then he returned to Bosnia and Herzegovina after the occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he wrote at the same time an article. It is more an article titled Patriotism, also in Arabic in 1884, and then his article was translated into Turkish in the journal called Vatan, and in the same year, part of his article was translated in Bosnian and published in Sarajevski List in 1884, which means that the Bosnian Muslims were interested in what their leaders or what their ulama have to say about the migrations and the challenges of staying under the non-Muslim rule. So Hafiz Muhammad Emin Hadžijahić, he said that just as man loves his children and his family, so he should love his homeland. How can we not love our homeland? Is there anything more important than faith and homeland? He said that those who propose migration are our compatriots who do not think about the consequences and who have not experienced the suffering of this world and think that emigration is advisable. What circumstances, he asked, force Muslim to emigrate according to Sharia. Undoubtedly, those such as an attack on our faith and on our family. But in our homeland, thank God, he said, not only is there no such unfavorable circumstances, but there is no trace of it. There is security of faith and property. The freedom and equality are guaranteed. Then he claims, then he gives the example of the really small town in the Herzegovina region in the south of the country called Livno. And he said that there used to be a lot of Bosnian Muslim noblemen who were respected and dignified, and who were respected members of the communities, but of their community. But after a lot of Bosnian Muslim, a lot of them migrated, there is no even trace of the Muslims' existence in this part of the country. What is interesting here is then in November 1998, Islamic community bi-weekly newspaper called Abode Revival published the article which deals with the emigration of Bosnian Muslims from the same region, Livno, and living in the US, and their relationship with their homeland and with their community. So his history is definitely repeating itself, at least when it comes to Bosnian Muslims. So Emin Hadžijahić said that those who left Livno did harm not only to themselves, but to their fellow believers who retained. And he said that if this situation persists, Islam in Bosnia will disappear. Later on, other publications such as journals which were established in the 1905 or 6 and lasted for a few years, dealt with the issue of migrations of Bosnian Muslims. For instance, in the paper Behar, which was published bi-monthly from 1900 to 1910, published article under the title "To Our Muslims Brother in Crete," published, which was the article is translation of the article published in, as it stated, 39th issue Islamic newspaper Arafat in Egypt in French language, because the editors and considered the article to be really important and relevant for the Bosnian Muslims. Then they translated the article. And it is stated amongst the others, Crete as well as Egypt is already lost. You were betrayed by the Ottoman state. Do not expect any help from Constantinople. Trust your brother Muslims who tell you the truth. Do not trust anybody but Almighty God. Strive like the rest of the intelligent and educated world for your survival and development. Do not intend to emigrate. Look at what happened to our Circassian brothers. Hundreds of thousands of them had died before they came to the places they wanted to migrate to. It is not the time for hijrah, because no one will persecute you in Crete for being a Muslim. Then in 1908, for instance, in the journal Musavat, which was published from 1906 to 1911, in Mostar, the other Herzegovinian town, and after that in Sarajevo, and it was printed simultaneously in Cyrillic and Latin and in Turkish. It is published. The article under the title "Don't Migrate, Brothers" was published, and it is said that unpleasant news are coming from some places in Krajina, which is the part of Bosnia and Herzegovina on the border with Croatia. In Krajina, that our millet, which is interesting that they use the term millet, has started migrating to Turkey. We only found out about this evil after the occupation. Until the occupation, our millet did not migrate from its homeland. The causes which prompt the people to emigrate are well known to our government from our writing, but it has always turned the deaf ear. The main reasons for migration, they mention Catholic propaganda, excessive fines, police arbitrariness, etc. And they mentioned really interesting case of a person, of a Bosnian Muslim who was fined by the Austrian government for taking a few pieces of wood from the forest, because in the Ottoman period it was not forbidden, and people who were living in rural areas were often doing that. But after the Austro-Hungarian occupation, it was forbidden, and the fines for that were excessive. So in this article, it was mentioned that a person who was caught and who got the fine that he cannot afford to pay, he then decided to migrate, to leave their home and to migrate to the Ottoman territory. So on the other side, the other reason for migration is mentioned Catholic propaganda, which was also widespread, that the proselytism was widespread, and the Bosnian Muslims were very often proselytized, or there were issues of the force conversion, but very often it was through the propaganda and through other means that the people converted. But it was nevertheless worrisome for the Islamic community leaders. This is really interesting that in this article it is stated that we beg our brothers who intend to migrate to do everything first before they decide to leave their homeland. Do not leave this country, because this and our should remain. Overwhelmed with the pain, we shout out to our brothers and the poet together, stay here. This is interesting because the poet they are referring to was Aleksa Šantić, Bosnian Serb poet who spent most of his life in Herzegovinian town of Mostar, which was his native town. His work, like that of many other Bosnian and Herzegovinian writers, is closely associated with his province. He wrote with moving sincerity of this unhappy fate of his fellow countrymen under the Austrian oppression. He was actually writing about the Bosnian Muslims who were migrating from Bosnia and Herzegovina after the occupation of by Austro-Hungary. His poem "Stay Here" was published in 1896 on the first page of the first issue of the literary magazine Zora, and was directed at Bosnian Muslims who were migrating in a mass. So it is stated, it is said in the song. It is a really beautiful song. It has a lot of verses, but I'll mention just a few here. Stay here, the sun that shines in a foreign place will never warm you like the sun in your own. The bread has a bitter taste there. There is no one, not even a brother. Who would find a better mother than one's own? And your mother is this country. Take a look upon the limestones and the field. Everywhere are the graveyards of your great grandfather. Stay here, for this country. They were noble giants, lights who knew how to defend it. You too should stay in this country and give the fund of your blood for it. The second wave of the migration of Bosnian Muslims, as I already mentioned, was the annexation in 1908, which raised the issue of hijra again. After finding out that following the annexation, unknown Turkish preacher proclaimed Bosnia as Darul Kufr, in which legal actions, as the preacher said, including religious practice and conclusion of marriage, are not valid. Then a madrasa, very young madrasa student from Tiranik, requested a fatwa from a well-known reformer, Muhammad Rashid Rida. The fact that this student sent a letter to the editor of Al-Manar indicates the influence of Islam movement among young Bosniaks of that time. He started with his question with a lot of epithets to Muhammad Rashid Rida. For instance, he said, after greeting you, oh excellent and great master, the learned, the understanding, the magnanimous and the unique, the proof of Islam, etc. So in the response, Muhammad Rashid Rida started with the explanation that the questioner is among those who are excessive in their love of Al-Manar and its editor, and he extols us with honorifics and epithets that are abashed to mention. Nonetheless, we will publish it exactly as it came to us. So basically, this student from Madrasa asked Muhammad Rashid Rida for the explanation for the Islamic law explanation of this Turkish preacher, Turkish preacher, how to say, naming Bosnia as characterizing Bosnia as Darul Kufr and propagation of migration. In his fatwa, published in 1909 in Al-Manar magazine, Muhammad Rashid Rida rejected the views of the Turkish preacher. He elaborated the issue of hijrah and concluded with the following. Muslim scholars agree that hijrah is obligatory in two cases. The first is when Muslims are not able to practice their religion because of the chaos fitna, forceful conversion or influence to act against religious norms. The second is when migration is needed to participate in jihad. Obviously, the second case was not applicable to the Bosniaks, nor the first one. With respect to ibadat and nikah, which was the direct reference to this Turkish preacher claiming that the nikah and ibadat is not valid if they were performed in Darul Kufr, which is Bosnia as he considered. Muhammad Rashid Rida concluded that the legal qualifications of a territory do not affect these acts. It is interesting to note that Sharia legal arguments of Muhammad Rashid Rida are similar to the arguments of Mehmet Tevfik Azapagic from 2 decades before, which indicates the significance of this Bosnian scholar. The significance of Rida's work on Bosnian ulama was considerable. From that time onward, in Bosnia, there was no influential alim who would suggest hijrah was a solution for his fellow countrymen. Even though Rida's fatwa significantly influenced the Bosnian ulama, the slowing down or stemming the migration was also contributed by the social, political, cultural transformation of the Ottoman state, marked with the rise of localism and ethnic feeling of identity. This led to the establishment of the new Bosniak national political identity with a secular dimension, which was nonetheless rooted in the old Muslim religious identity. This is why many of the Bosniaks do not consider themselves, if they are not religious, do not consider themselves even as part of Bosniak national political identity. But people who or alims who migrated during this period offer different perspective. One of them is Hilmi ibn Hussein Taslijali, known as Bosnali Hilmi Baba. He was from the town of Teslija, Pljevlja, which is in the Sanjak region of Serbia, which after the First Balkan War came under Serbian administration. He spent some time in Istanbul and then lived in Medina, where in 1885 he wrote Risala fi al-Hijra, Val Muhajirun, treatise on the Hijra and Muhajirun, and it was at the same time when Mehmet Tevfik Azapagic wrote his Risala. So Mehmet Tevfik Azapagic was in Bosnia, and Hilmi Baba Bosnali, Hilmi Baba, he migrated to Istanbul and later on in Medina. He stressed in this treatise, he stressed that staying in Darul Kufr, as he characterized Bosnia, was haram and the migration was mandatory. But as an anti-modernist, he didn't recommend hijra to Istanbul, which became Darul Harb, according to him, as a result of modernization reforms, but to eastern parts of the Darul Islam, where, I quote, Sharia is in force, the ruler is just and willing to fight the enemies. He advised them to settle in the mountains, to engage in agriculture, and to allow the poor mujahirs to work on their lands and share the harvests. Just a second to check the time. Okay, the views of Hilmi ibn Hussein or Bosnali Hilmi Baba appeared as the views of a scholar who grew up on the frontier of the Muslim world, who was educated in the shadow of the Taqlid tradition, a conservative disappointed by the corruption and incompetency of the ruling circle of the declining Bosnian Ottoman state. His views sometimes were even apocalyptic, and it is not how much he influenced the Muslims from Bosnia or later from Sanjak, from Novi Pazar, but the fact that the complete villages from Bosnia, Muhajirs from Bosnia, were found in Syria, Palestine, or Sinai tell us that there were Bosniaks, at least, who thought along the same lines. After the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there were no other alims who would suggest, after the Rashid Rida's fatwa, who would suggest that the Bosnian Muslims should migrate from Bosnia. But the hijra of Bosniaks never gradually stopped, or were at least no longer massive. But the migration continued from among the Bosniaks from the Sanjak in Novi Pazar, but the historical circumstances were different in Bosnia and in parts of Serbia, where, first of all, Sanjak continued to be part of the Ottoman state until the end of First World War. Then preserved longer ties with Istanbul and did not experience life under the Austria-Hungary. The intellectual leadership of the Sanjak Bosniaks of that time consisted mostly of traditionally trained Ulama, and as a result, the ideas stemming from a new approach to the interpretation of the Islamic law took hold in this region only later in the period between two world wars. Even though there were no mass waves of migrations in the rest of the 20th century until the end of the 20th century, many Muslims still the migrations were continuously, but not in a mass wave, except the region of Novi Pazar, as I mentioned above. So earlier, so a lot of articles from in the period after the Second World War were dealing with the migration of the Bosniaks from the Sanjak regions. For instance, Bosniaks in parts of Serbia as you can see in this article here, they are moving to Turkey or Albania, and the Bosnian Muslims were using hijra or for the explanation, or we're explaining hijra in more metaphorical terms. So there were no even treaties or even opinions about migrations of Bosnian Muslims, because, as I said, it was not on a mass scale. It was until the end of 20th century. Here you can see an article published by the Journal of the Islamic Community in the 1970s, which actualized actually Mehmet Tevfik Azepagic Risala and Mehmed Emin Hajjajic article about the patriotism. So Bosnian Ulama in the middle of during the period after the Second World War and the beginning of the Bosnian War in 1992, they were just claiming, they were just writing about the authors or alims who wrote about hijra, or they were using hijra as a metaphor. But in the 1990s, after the new wave of the mass migration, first of all, the issue of hijra became actualized again, but also the views of these scholars or Bosnian alims from the end of 19th and the beginning of 20th centuries were actualized. For instance, in the 1992, in September 1992, which was after a few months of the aggression on Bosnia and Herzegovina and ethnic cleansing of Muslims in most part of the eastern Bosnia and Herzegovina, Islamic community issued the proclamation. It is stated that in a situation when the vital interest of the Muslim people are in danger, the Islamic community has a moral and historical obligation to disclose its views on the exodus to which Muslims are exposed in this area. Starting from the general religious principle that a Muslim is obliged to oppose evil, we emphasize that the defense of one's homeland is a farzi ayn, a personal obligation and a strict duty of every adult Muslim. The 5-month course of aggression against the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina has clearly shown that it is in the function of extermination of Muslims and ethnic cleansing of territories, and that this goal is achieved by brutal force and terror, as well as resettlement and evacuation. In the circumstances of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are no conditions for religiously based emigrations of Muslims. Instead of emigrating, there is only one way: to defend our own only homeland and to ensure our survival. So basically, during the war, two main issues were raised regarding the hijra. First of all, the obligation of defending one's homeland, which of course discouraged the hijra or migration. And second of all, after the war ended, it was reiterated that the part of the hijra is returned to the homeland. So it was continuously the Hadith and Sunnah, which deal with migration, are continued interpreted in a way that obliged Muslims to stay. First of all, during when their physical existence is in danger, and second of all, if they had to migrate to return to homelands after the end of these circumstances. So there are a number of articles written or short statements written by the Bosnian scholars, or official statements given by the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina. For instance, in the peak of war in 1992, one of the Bosnian scholars wrote in the Preparod, the Islamic official biweekly journal, about the migration, about the hijrah of the Prophet and how it relates to the situation of Bosnian Muslims. Contemporary refugee and exile, he states, of some Bosnian Muslims is a result of war, and in our opinion, from the point of view of Islam, has the status of a small hijrah, emigration as an act of necessary withdrawal in order to return. It is known that Quran, in the case of endangering the survival of Muslims, provides migration as one of the solutions. On the other hand, in the case of aggression against Muslims, resistance is required. And then the ayah is quoted, and the fight in the cause of God, those who fight you but do not commit aggression. God doesn't love the aggressor. It is the verse from Quran 119 in the second surah. So then this scholar said that the question which arises is, what does it all mean to us today? For us, it means that the hijrah is acceptable as the last resort. After do we everything we can, but the resistance is the obligation. The example of the Prophet shows this well. He performed the hijrah from Mecca to Medina to organize there and prepare for a victorious return, the liberation of Mecca. This is why it is up to all relevant factors in this country, in addition to leading the armed struggle to liberate country from aggressors, to work systematically on organizing the return of our refugees. Then a number of articles were continued to be published in the official Islamic publication during the war, but also in special journals that were established during the war in order to boost the morale of the Bosnian Muslims who were fighting in the Bosnian army troops. For instance, in such journal in 1994, the other Bosnian scholar wrote a series of articles about migration, about the Sharia legal arguments of migration. For instance, the title here is to go in order to return with more power. This was published in 1994, again in the peak of the war, and it was also stated that the Prophet Muhammad moved from Mecca to Medina not to escape but to return in an organized manner. It is only a complete and a successful hijrah. Then he claimed how hijrah how hijrah helps our spiritual and also physical strength. He was criticizing then Muslims who were living outside Bosnia and Herzegovina. Why didn't they receive Bosnian Muslims as muhajirs, first of all? And a lot of Bosnian scholars claimed that emigration of Bosnian Muslims and then resettlement of them in different European countries was one of the mean how to affect the physical strength of the Bosnian Muslims to defend themselves during the war. So in the photo here, it is really interesting. This is the photo of two boys. Underneath, it was written that these are the Bosnian Muslims who will not be obliged, who will not have to migrate. They will not have to migrate later on, it was indicating that the Bosnian Muslim will defend themselves, and they will create a country in which Bosnian Muslims could live a prosperous life and will not be obliged or in a situation where their physical existence is in danger, and that they have to leave. Later on, since migration of Bosnian Muslims also continued after the war, it is understandable because people, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a poor country. It was a devastated country during the war. So a lot of people could not stay in Bosnia, and because they couldn't have, they couldn't get jobs. So a lot of people migrated, especially during the 2000s, and in this wave of migration, a lot of Muslims came to the United States of America. To stand this new waves of migration, Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina organized a number of seminars or like public events in which they explained why Muslims should stay in Bosnia and Herzegovina, first of all, and second of all, why the displaced Muslim should return to their homes, destroyed homes during the war. So this was interesting. This was published in journal Preparod about how Hijra, the role of Hijra in physical existence of the Bosniaks, and the banner which was used for promoting the event said that Bosnia is your home, stay. Bosnia is your destiny, stay. In Bosnia, you should preserve Islam, stay. So in during these events, a number of Bosnian scholars, including Reis Ulemas, who were in the office in different periods of time, emphasized that Hijra should not be an incentive for us, that should be an incentive for us to finish our Hijra to return to our homes. So they were basically encouraged people who stayed in Bosnia to stay in Bosnia, and people who left Bosnia to return to their pre-war homes, or at least to return to Bosnia and Herzegovina. So these were this was very common during the 2000s to organize this kind of events, or to give short articles about the meaning of Hijra for the Bosniaks today, etc. But what is interesting is that these questions are still relevant for the Muslims, for some of the Muslims today. So, for instance, in Preparod, there is a rubric for asking the question, and then Fatwa in Yemen responds to the question in the next volume of the journal. But you can also ask the question on the website of the Preparod of the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I screenshotted that part of the website here. So you can email Fatwa Yemen and ask different questions. So one of the questions that was posed in late 2020 was from the Bosnian Muslim, who asked, is it justified to do the hijrah in order to acquire property and better conditions of work? In the case when in Bosnia, I have thank Allah Almighty, nice life and above average income, quite enough for a comfortable life. So the person was asking. He was explaining that a lot of people from Bosnia were advising him to move from Bosnia and to migrate to some Western European country where he could get a much higher salary for the same job. But he was claiming that he has a nice average salary in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and his life was nice there. So he was curious: is it possible? Does Sharia law allow to migrate only for acquiring property or better conditions? So the answer for this question was that from Fatwa Yamin was that if an income was decent in homeland, and if you don't need to migrate to search for a job, for we believe that you don't have a valid reason to emigrate, especially having in mind risks that emigration entails, preservation of the religious and national identity, especially if it is a permanent departure from the homeland. Then the questions that were asked, for instance, are if it is haram for us Muslims to vote in non-Muslim countries in elections for party programs that are not Sharia acceptable, for instance, approving homosexuality, and whether voting for candidates who have such a favorable program for Muslims in non-Muslim countries introduce shirk and kufr as interpreted by some persons who complete fiqh at Islamic colleges in Arab countries. This just needs short clarification. I'll end soon. This person is referring to the people who complete fiqh at Islamic colleges in Arabic countries. So during the war and after the war, especially, a number of the fighters from and aid organizations from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, etc., came to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a lot of them stayed after the war with their humanitarian aid work, and they organized themselves. And a lot of Muslims started following or adhering to these communities that practice as so-called different Islam. So there were a number of clashes between the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina and those who were practiced Islam in a way of Saudi Arabia, or the Saudi influence was the biggest one. So even during the war, for instance, people would say that they would propagate the Islam that was not familiar to them, and a lot of people did not want to accept those interpretations as valid interpretations of Islam. So after the war, there was one period of the great influence of the Bosnian Muslims who were financially supported by the Saudi Arabia government to finish universities in Saudi Arabia, and upon their return, they would organize public lectures, or nowadays on the YouTube lectures, or Facebook, like social media networks, in which they would reply to the questions asked in a manner that was not compatible with the traditional way of practicing of Islam in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So Islamic communities tried to integrate them in the Islamic community, but many of them did not want to be integrated because they were criticizing Islamic Bosnian interpretation of Islam. And during the 2016 or 15, there was a big clash between those communities and the Islamic community, which was supported by state, and the independent organization of those communities was forbidden, and there is a state surveillance on their public lectures, and because preachers of certain certain preachers of these communities would, for instance, advise Bosnian Muslims to go to Syria, and then a number of Muslims, a number of young Bosnian Muslims went to Syria, and it became a security problem. So this person refers to different answer to this question given by the person who adhered to the Saudi Arabian, if I may say so, interpretation of the Islamic rule. Answer was, among others, that voting in this election is not shirk or kufr, but a good deed if it is done with the intention of giving a better vote and preventing worse candidates from coming to power. So I'll close my presentation here. I hope I didn't take too much of your time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Memisevic. That was a very interesting presentation, and actually one that I think opens a door to history that many of us are not familiar with. I work in Islamic studies and Islamic thought, and you opened a door for me that I was not aware of a lot of these things. So thank you for that. Very interesting presentation. At this time, I'd like to encourage attendees to type in their questions in the Q&A. If you're on a laptop, mine appears at the bottom. Others may, if you're on a smartphone, you may need to move around a little bit to find it. Sometimes you look for the 3 dots and you'll find it there. While we're waiting for the questions, I have a question myself. So we saw a wide variety of fatwas regarding this idea of the hijra, migration. And I wonder if you're familiar with let's say the fatwas of those in the regions that were receiving these migrants, where their fatwas issued about receiving, how we receive these migrants. I mean, I know you talked about Rashid Rida, who was outside of this, and others. And I wonder if you could maybe, if there's something there that you encountered.
For instance, during I was looking into the documents of when the Balkan Muslims came into in Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. You can discern three positions of the ulama there. First, it was encouraging migration of Muslims in the Ottoman territory, but then the question of where Istanbul, where the Ottoman Empire will settle those migrants, and when the numbers of people were coming there, then they changed a little bit at least their stance towards the Muslims from Bosnia and Herzegovina, because it was under the Austro-Hungarian occupation. So it was claimed that Muslims can practice religion there, so they can. There is an obligation to come. And then the third, it was the second wave of this in this period of from 1878 until 1908. And the third was again reluctant toward the migration, and some of the Bosnian Muslims went to Istanbul to speak with ulama there, how they could or why now it is discouraged for Muslims. Ulama who were pro-migration asked about what to do with the Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, and what I noticed is that within these responses was discouraging migrations from the Austro-Hungary, but also encouraging of people from who already migrated to be integrated into the society. So I don't know if that answers your question, yes, but that is what I noticed. What I noticed regarding the Bosnian Muslims experience, and also if you can recall this anti-modernist Bosnali Hilmi Baba, he was advising that the first who should migrate first is the wealthy people, and then they should resettle and deal with agriculture, and then invite poor people from Bosnia, Darul Kufr, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and employ them as their helpers and or workers, so they could be integrated into the society.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Well, we have already a few questions. The first question reads, and this is referring to the Ottoman era, was migration to Istanbul also discouraged because of bad relations with the Ottoman Empire?
That's a really interesting question. It was not discouraged, only by anti-modernists it was discouraged. But the official stance of the Ulama in Bosnia was not to migrate. So nowhere, including Ottoman Empire and Istanbul.
Thank you. The next question says, thank you, Professor Memisevic. How would you describe the homeland that the Muslim intellectuals in your study invoke? Did it coincide with the territorial parameters of Bosnia-Herzegovina, or was it more expansive and conceptual? What was the homeland's imagined future in the late 19th century after 1878?
That's again an excellent question. Regarding to Bosnian Muslim ulama, Bosnia and Herzegovina was their homeland is the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the whole Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the sense of the after Berlin Congress nation state. So in the borders of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that was the homeland for Bosnian Muslims to stay and to live with other members of the other communities and confessions as they used to live during the Ottoman Empire. So basically, they were just claiming that even though the rule changed, even though Bosnia and Herzegovina is under the non-Muslim rule now, even though Muslims became a minority and they were dominant group during the Ottoman Empire, this is still the country that belongs to Bosnian Muslims as well as to other nationalities and ethnic groups and confessional group in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you. And what was the homeland's imagined future?
Imagined future was at the beginning to be part of the Austro-Hungaria. There were like the attitude of Bosnian Muslims or Bosnian people in general toward Austro-Hungarian changed. At the beginning, there was also the resistance of the Ottoman of the Bosnian Muslims to the Austro-Hungaria occupation, and it was also it was the armed resistance after Bosnian Muslims realized that the Ottoman Empire, as they claimed, gave Bosnia to Austro-Hungaria. Then they organized themselves to defend their homeland, their country, against the occupation by Austro-Hungaria. And during that period, they asked leaders of these organized group went to Mostar to ask an alim about what should they do about like a religious Sharia law argumentation for their resistance to Austro-Hungaria, and then the alim said that they can do anything. There is no obligation to resist, because if the Istanbul, if the Ottoman state permitted or didn't resist to losing the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina and to occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, then there is no point in resisting it locally. And the members of the movement were so furious that they killed the person, that they killed the alim because he gave the answer that they didn't want. And later on, they resisted. Of course, they lost, and then Bosnia and Herzegovina was occupied, but the occupation was just postponed a little by this armed resistance. And then after a few years, people figured out that they could actually live in Austro-Hungaria, and there is a certain amount of freedom and the equality, even though there were different movements to proselytize, as I already mentioned, but it was not forceful. So people realized that they could practice the religion, they have freedom. So the stance toward the Austro-Hungarian rule changed, and now people now look at the 30-year period of Austro-Hungarian rule as a peak of the Bosnian development of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they even resist. A lot of people resist to call it colonialism as a fact of calling of Bosnia and Herzegovina as the colony of Austro-Hungary, because they think Austro-Hungary monarchy gave back from the resources that they exploited. They invest them into rebuilding and developing of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So this relationship with the Austro-Hungarian rule changed and evolved during this 30 years of period.
Interesting. Well, this is now a question about the present. I know you mentioned a 2020 fatwa. Here's a question that says, how do modern Bosnians or Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks feel about staying in their country? Do they want to travel to a more Islamic country or a developed European country or America? So I guess kind of an ethnographic or maybe a kind of a population surveys. What do you see? I know it's outside the survey of your presentation, but maybe.
Yeah, it's an amazing question. I forgot to mention that one of the reasons why I decided to research about this is that I noticed that by the end of 20th and in the beginning of 20th century, Muslims migrated to the east, and during the end of 20th century and until today, they migrated to the west. So I was interested in the reasons why they why there is such a shift in direction of migrations. So Bosnian Muslims are mainly secularized Muslims. So they consider themselves more of they consider prevalent part of their identity to be the European one. So a lot of people are not religious, and during the war, when some of the refugees were settled in some Muslim countries, including Pakistan, for instance, they feel limited there. They wanted freedom to practice or not practice religion. So there were instances when they would protest being settled in such countries such as Islamic, because of the limitation of their freedom. Nowadays, people from Bosnia are mainly migrating to the Western Europe. During the 2000s, there were two biggest wave of migration to the US. It depends also, on the circumstances which country will allow resettlement. Nowadays, it is mostly Germany and the Western European countries. Unfortunately, people in Bosnia, especially young people in Bosnia, are migrating in a mass waves. It is the result of the political tensions and constant crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina, of the special constitution that keeps Bosnia in one place without the possibility of progress. It's because of the corruption and all these problems that they were also noticed by some of those scholars, even during the 19th and the beginning of 20th century. And unfortunately, there are still people who do not see the bright future in Bosnia and want to migrate.
Thank you. Well, this relates to the next question. With regard to presumably those who go to the Western countries, do they maintain their ethnic communities, or do they readily assimilate?
Bosnian Muslims are well known, and I would say sometimes their potential to be integrated and assimilated is misused and abused by the government of Western European country, because they would claim this is the proper way of being integrated into the society. So unfortunately, a lot of people accepts or assimilates completely, but there are like communities, Bosniak communities, they're very often organized around the mosque, and they meet each other around the mosque, and they are very interested in the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and how can they help, or how can they organize themselves. So there are organizations, informal organizations of Bosnian Muslims in the diaspora or in Western Europe, and they are organized around imam, around the mosque, etc. But I have to say also that the practice of Islam in Bosnia is really diverse, and people could consider themselves to be religious if they don't eat pork and nothing else. If they don't practice anything else, but they don't eat pork, so they would consider themselves to being religious. Or if they don't drink alcohol during Ramadan. So it's not a monolithic picture of how Islam looks like and how should be practiced. And when someone wants to impose the real or the correct way of practice Islam, there is a big resistance. And during the war, I mentioned that with these foreign fighters who would claim that the tradition of Bosnian Muslims are bidah, and that they should be dismissed, there was a big resistance. And that's why there is not such a big influence of the Saudi Arabia in Bosnia and Herzegovina, mainly because of the resistance of local population to this interpretation of Islam, which is considered new and not acceptable to on the soil of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Mm. Thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, we have reached the end of our session. I'd like to thank our attendees for their very interesting questions. And I especially want to thank Professor Memisevic for an excellent presentation, an eye-opening presentation, and for answering these questions. We really appreciate it. And there's actually another question. If you'd like to answer, type in your answer in the Q&A. But this concludes our session, and I want to thank you all. And thank you. Thank you again, Professor Memisevic.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming, and I wish you a pleasant day.
Likewise. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.